Weddings are supposed to be magical. But these stories? They're straight up war zones. Family sabotage, cold feet, and plots no RSVP could have prepared for. These savage endings prove one thing: you can plan the perfect wedding, but you can't plan for betrayal? This is Wedding Plots and Vows Gone Wrong.
My SIL faked a pregnancy to ruin my wedding. The clink of champagne glasses had barely faded when Lisa stood up, tears sparkling in her eyes. I was still sitting at the head table, my new husband's hand warm in mine, when she tapped her glass with a fork and cleared her throat dramatically. "Everyone," she said, voice trembling just enough to sound authentic, "I have something to share." The room, still buzzing from the first dances and toasts, fell quiet. My heart sank, not because I knew exactly what was coming. Not yet, but because I knew Lisa. And Lisa didn't cry without an audience. "I wasn't going to say anything today," she continued, one manicured hand pressing theatrically to her flat stomach. "But I just can't keep it a secret any longer." My husband, Matt, stiffened beside me. He knew Lisa too. The words came out in a rush, soaked in false humility. "I'm pregnant," she sobbed, beaming through her tears. The guests gasped, a few clapping politely, confused but swept along by the emotion of it all. All eyes shifted. Off me. Off Matt. Off the vows we had barely finished speaking. And onto her. Lisa, standing there in her glittering bridesmaid gown, stealing the spotlight without a second thought. Matt squeezed my hand harder under the table. My mouth was dry. My cheeks burned. I forced a smile, or something close to it, while the room erupted around us. Such a blessing. A wedding and a baby in the same year. Your family has so much to celebrate. The walls felt like they were closing in. This was supposed to be my day. Our day. And Lisa had hijacked it with 3 little words. I couldn't prove anything yet. Not here. Not now. But deep down, deeper than words could reach, I knew. Lisa's announcement wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a happy accident. It was a move. Calculated. Cold. Cruel. And by the time I finally uncovered the truth, it would leave everyone speechless. Especially her. Looking back, the signs were there. I just didn't want to see them. In the months leading up to the wedding, Lisa had been different. Not overtly hostile. Not openly rude. Just off. At first, I blamed it on stress. After all, weddings brought out the worst in a lot of people. Family dynamics, travel plans, endless fittings. It wasn't exactly a recipe for calm. Lisa had been one of the first people I asked to be in my bridal party. Matt's only sister. The woman who was supposed to become my family too. I wanted her to feel included, important. And she did at first. She gushed about dresses. She sent me endless Pinterest boards full of flower arrangements and table settings. She insisted, on helping plan my bridal shower. But slowly things shifted. She started questioning every decision I made. "Are you sure that's the color you want for the bridesmaids' dresses? It might wash you out. Maybe you should rethink the venue. It's a little modest, don't you think?" At the bachelorette party, she spent the night complaining about the food, the music, the decor. All things she had helped pick. She rolled her eyes when I tried on veils. She sighed heavily during cake tastings. Small things. Easy to brush off. It wasn't until the week of the wedding that it became harder to ignore. She missed the final dress fitting without calling. She forgot to pick up the table cards. She showed up 2 hours late to the rehearsal dinner, looking annoyed and offering no real apology. Still, I made excuses for her. She's busy. She's overwhelmed. She'll come around. Because what else was I supposed to believe? I had no way of knowing that Lisa wasn't overwhelmed. She wasn't stressed. She was planning her own moment. A bigger, louder, more dazzling moment. One designed to overshadow mine completely. And as much as it hurt to realize it, that had been her plan all along. Lisa had always been the golden child. The Bennett family practically revolved around her, a glittering sun no one dared eclipse. Growing up, Matt said she could do no wrong. Star athlete. Prom queen. Graduated college early, with honors, of course. Married young to a man from a good family. Everything she touched turned to gold. Or at least, that's what everyone was supposed to believe. At family gatherings, Lisa didn't just attend, she performed. Stories about her career successes. Photo shoots of her designer wardrobe. Detailed updates about her perfect marriage, her perfect house, her perfect life. It wasn't enough for Lisa to be happy. She had to be admired. Envied. The few times Matt hinted that things might not be so picture-perfect. A rough patch in her marriage, a failed promotion. His parents shut him down immediately. Don't be negative, his mother would snap. Lisa works so hard. She deserves good things. Deserve. That was a word the Bennetts used a lot when they talked about Lisa. She deserved the best. She deserved attention. She deserved sympathy for every minor inconvenience life threw her way. And somehow, without anyone ever saying it out loud, the rest of us absorbed the unspoken rule. When Lisa wanted the spotlight, you gave it to her. No questions asked. Matt had learned to shrug it off. That's just Lisa, he'd say when she monopolized conversations or turned birthdays into competitions. And for a long time, I had accepted that, too. I didn't need to compete with her. I had Matt. We had our life, our love, our future. Until our wedding came along. Until it became clear that for once, I was the one at the center of everything. And Lisa? Lisa couldn't stand it. She didn't know how to let someone else have their moment. So instead of celebrating with us, she decided to steal what she thought was rightfully hers. No matter the cost. No matter the lies. The week of the wedding should have been magical. Instead, it felt like trying to steer a ship through a brewing storm. And Lisa was the one kicking up the waves. It started with little things. At the final venue walkthrough, she accidentally knocked over the centerpiece samples. Then laughed it off like it was nothing. I'm just so clumsy these days, she said, winking at the coordinator. At the bridesmaids' luncheon, she made a snide joke about how tight my dress must be getting. Hope you can breathe on the big day, she giggled, as if insulting the bride was perfectly normal. When my maid of honor, my best friend Julia, tried to intervene, Lisa pulled her aside and warned her not to stress the bride out. Claire's emotional, she said, loud enough for me to hear. We have to be extra patient with her. I smiled through gritted teeth, bit my tongue until it nearly bled. It wasn't worth fighting. Not yet. On the night of the rehearsal dinner, Lisa delivered the final blow. She showed up in a white dress. Not cream. Not blush. White. A sleek, off-the-shoulder designer gown that could have passed for a second wedding dress if you glanced too quickly. When Matt's mother complimented her, Lisa laughed and said, "Well, when you look this good, you have to flaunt it." The other bridesmaids bristled. Julia actually looked ready to throw her wine glass. But I stayed calm, smiled, refused to let her win. Because deep down I could feel it. Lisa was pushing boundaries for a reason, testing how much attention she could steal without being called out. And now, standing on the edge of my wedding weekend, I knew one thing for certain. She wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. And if I wasn't careful, she would find a way to make my wedding about her. No matter how many lies she had to tell. The whispers started the morning of the wedding. Soft. Subtle. Slithering through the bridal suite, like smoke no one wanted to acknowledge. I caught snippets while getting my hair done. A bridesmaid glancing nervously at another. A half-finished sentence cut off when I entered the room. I brushed it off at first. Pre-wedding jitters. Nerves. But as the hours ticked by, the energy shifted. Something was wrong. Something I wasn't being told. Julia pulled me aside just before I stepped into my dress. "There's something you should know," she said, biting her lip. "It's probably nothing, but..." "What?" I asked, my heart lurching. She hesitated. Lisa's been saying things, dropping hints. About being pregnant. Pregnant. The word hung between us, heavy and sour. I felt my stomach flip, the room tilting slightly around me. Pregnant? Now. Today. I swallowed hard. Is it true? Julia's expression said it all. "I don't know," she whispered. "But she's definitely talking about it. To anyone who'll listen." I leaned back against the vanity, feeling suddenly disconnected from my own reflection. Why would she? But I already knew why. Because nothing could pull focus faster than a baby announcement. Because nothing could upstage a bride faster than the promise of new life. I stared at my wedding dress hanging in the corner. The dress I had spent months dreaming about. The dress that was supposed to mark the beginning of my forever. And I realized, with a sick twist of certainty, Lisa wasn't content being part of the day. She wanted to own it. To make sure that when people remembered my wedding, they would remember her too. Her announcement. Her moment. Her carefully staged performance. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply, forcing my hands to stop shaking. Not today, I thought. You don't get to take today from me. No matter what lies she spun. No matter how much attention she craved. This day would not belong to her. Not if I had anything to say about it. The reception was everything I had dreamed of. At first, twinkling lights wrapped the trees outside the venue. The dance floor pulsed with music and laughter. Our families mingled, glasses raised in celebration. For a few precious hours, I let myself believe that love, real love, could outshine everything else. And then Lisa stood up. I watched her rise from her seat like a queen ascending a throne, tapping her fork against her glass to demand the room's attention. I knew before she even opened her mouth. "My family," she began, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "I know today is about Claire and Matt." A few guests chuckled warmly. Polite. Encouraging. Lisa smiled, wide and luminous. "But," she continued, pressing her hand dramatically to her stomach, "I just found out some news, and I can't keep it in any longer." The room leaned in. Chairs creaked as people turned to face her. "I'm pregnant," she blurted, her voice catching with fake emotion. "We're having a baby." Gasps. Cheers. Applause. The DJ scrambled to lower the music. My mother-in-law clutched her hands to her chest, tears springing to her eyes. Cameras flashed. Phones lifted. Lisa's grin widened as she soaked in the spotlight she had carved out for herself, with a lie. Beside me, Matt swore softly under his breath, his hand clenching into a fist on the table. Julia shot me a horrified look from across the room. For a second, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. This was supposed to be our first dance, our first toast, our first memory as husband and wife. And Lisa had stolen it without blinking. I pasted a brittle smile onto my face, forcing myself to sit up straighter. Not today. Not now. She could steal the cameras. She could steal the gasps and applause. But she would not steal my dignity. And soon enough, very soon, she would regret ever thinking she could. Because some lies are too big to hold up under their own weight. And Lisa was about to find that out the hard way. After the shock of Lisa's announcement wore off, something didn't sit right. It gnawed at me through the toasts, through the cake cutting, through the forced smiles and hugs and congratulations. Her story didn't add up. I couldn't shake it. The way she had touched her stomach too deliberately. The way her husband, Ryan, had looked at her like he was seeing the announcement for the first time too. The stunned confusion that flickered across his face before he quickly covered it with a shaky smile. No one else seemed to notice. Or maybe they didn't want to notice. They were too busy gushing over her. Too busy congratulating her. Too busy letting the magic of the moment blind them. But I saw it. The cracks. When Julia cornered me near the dessert table later that night, I knew she had seen them too. "You don't believe her, do you?" she asked in a low voice, her eyes scanning the room to make sure no one overheard. I shook my head slowly. "Something's off," I whispered back. "I don't know what it is yet, but it's not real." Julia nodded grimly. "I've been watching her all night. She's not acting like someone who just found out they're pregnant. She was acting like someone who had rehearsed this performance. Down to the trembling voice. The misty eyes. The carefully placed hand. But there were no quiet, teary moments between her and Ryan. No glances of awe or tenderness. Only smugness. Only calculation. And the more I watched her, the more certain I became. Lisa didn't love the idea of becoming a mother. She loved the idea of becoming the center of attention. No matter what it cost. Including her dignity. Including our family. Including me. I didn't know how yet. Or when. But I promised myself right then and there. I would find the truth. And when I did, Lisa's empire of lies would come crashing down. Louder than any toast she ever stole. The morning after the wedding, while most guests were still nursing hangovers and scrolling through photos, Julia showed up at my hotel room with a plan. She didn't even knock. Just barged in with 2 coffees, a notebook, and that dangerous gleam in her eyes she usually reserved for Black Friday sales. "I couldn't sleep," she said, dropping onto the couch. And I started thinking, if Lisa really is pregnant, there'll be signs. I took the coffee gratefully, my brain still foggy from too little sleep and too much emotional whiplash. "What kind of signs?" I asked. Julia flipped open the notebook, already brimming with ideas. Prenatal appointments. Pharmacy pickups. Insurance paperwork. Something. Nobody just finds out they're pregnant and has no proof. I raised an eyebrow. "You want to spy on her?" "Not spy," she said, grinning wickedly. "Investigate." I hesitated. It felt wrong. Petty. But then I remembered Lisa standing in the center of that reception hall, soaking up the spotlight, turning my wedding into her personal announcement party. And I remembered the hollow ache in my chest as the attention, the love, shifted away from us. No, this wasn't petty. This was necessary. "If we find something," I said slowly, "we have to be smart about how we use it." Julia nodded. "Of course. This isn't about blowing up your family. It's about making sure the truth comes out, on your terms. Over the next few days, we worked quietly. Julia found a contact at the pharmacy Lisa frequented, an old high school friend who owed her a favor. I casually texted Ryan, congratulating him and asking friendly questions. The more we dug, the clearer it became. There were no doctor's appointments, no prenatal vitamins, no insurance updates, no plans, no excitement from Ryan, only confusion and a growing sense of unease. Lisa's story unraveled faster than we expected. And with every new piece of information, I felt a little stronger, a little braver, a little closer to taking back what she had stolen, because now we had proof. And soon the whole family would too. It didn't take long for the cracks to split wide open. 3 days after the wedding, Julia forwarded me a series of screenshots. Quiet proof that Lisa's story was already unraveling. There were no prenatal vitamins listed in her pharmacy records. No folic acid supplements. No prescriptions tied to a new pregnancy. Nothing. Meanwhile, Ryan, who had seemed more bewildered than joyful at the reception, finally cracked under the weight of it all. He called Matt late one night, his voice tight and uncertain, like he was still trying to make sense of it himself. "I don't know what's going on," he said, words tumbling out in a rush. One minute she's crying and talking about cribs, the next she's brushing me off and changing the subject. She won't show me a test. She keeps saying it's too early to see a doctor. Matt stayed silent, listening, letting him talk. "And the thing is," Ryan continued, dropping his voice even lower, "we weren't even trying. We haven't really been close, in a while." He didn't need to spell it out. The implication hung heavy in the air. If they hadn't even been intimate, then there was no way Lisa could be pregnant. No way her dramatic announcement was anything but a fabrication. Matt offered a few quiet words of support, promised discretion, and hung up. For a long moment, we just sat there at the kitchen table, the dim light buzzing faintly above us, the truth sinking in like a stone. Lisa hadn't just lied. She had staged an entire performance. She had weaponized the joy of new life to sabotage ours. And for what? For attention? For validation? For the hollow applause that came from stealing someone else's moment? Whatever twisted satisfaction she thought she had won, it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what came next. Because lies that big can't be buried forever. They fester. They poison everything around them. And eventually, no matter how carefully constructed, they collapse. Lisa's day of reckoning wasn't just coming. It was already here. We didn't rush. That was the first rule Matt and I agreed on. Lisa had detonated her bomb at the reception, grabbing as much attention as she could before slipping back into silence. She probably thought the chaos had passed, that the applause had sealed her lie beyond question. She was wrong. The second rule we agreed on: no drama. If we exposed her, it wouldn't be with shouting matches or public humiliation. We weren't going to sink to her level. She craved spectacle. We would offer quiet truth. A few days later, my opportunity arrived. Matt's parents decided to host a small family brunch the following Sunday. One last wedding celebration before guests flew home. Lisa would be there. Ryan would be there. Everyone who mattered would be seated around that table. I could have called her out in front of everyone. Could have demanded answers. Could have thrown the evidence onto the table like an indictment. But that wasn't the plan. Instead, I asked Julia to casually mention a special surprise we had planned for brunch, a little announcement of our own. Curiosity spread like wildfire through the group texts. Even Lisa couldn't resist texting me late that night. "Can't wait to hear your news. Hope it's as exciting as mine," winking face. I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. There was no need to reply. The trap was already set. Matt and I spent that week preparing, gathering the proof, practicing what we would say, making sure every move was deliberate. We weren't going to accuse. We weren't going to insult. We were simply going to tell the truth. And once the truth was spoken aloud, it would be impossible to unhear. Lisa's castle of lies was already crumbling. All we had to do was give it one final, gentle push. And then stand back and watch it fall. The brunch started like any other family gathering. Warm smiles, clinking glasses, laughter a little too loud. Lisa arrived late, of course, floating through the doorway in a sundress that clung a little too tightly to her suspiciously unchanged figure. No morning sickness, no tiredness, no signs of the woman she claimed to be. I watched her work the room, collecting congratulations, soaking up admiration. It might have almost been impressive, if it hadn't been so deeply pathetic. Julia caught my eye from across the table and gave a tiny nod. It was time. Matt stood first, clearing his throat lightly to gather everyone's attention. I just wanted to thank everyone again, he said, smiling easily. For being part of our wedding. For your support. For your love. Murmured agreement echoed around the table. And, he continued, we wanted to take a moment to celebrate something else. Lisa's eyes lit up. She leaned forward, practically vibrating with excitement, already preparing for another round of stolen applause. Matt turned to me, and I rose slowly from my chair. We're so grateful to start this next chapter with honesty and real family values, I said, my voice steady, carrying just enough weight to sharpen the room's focus. Which is why we want to share some news. Whispers rippled. Chairs shifted. Some truths, I added, letting my gaze drift deliberately to Lisa. Her smile faltered just slightly. Julia handed Matt a small folder. The printed pharmacy records, the insurance statements, the texts. Matt laid it calmly in the center of the table. We thought everyone should have the chance to celebrate real beginnings, he said. Dead silence. Lisa blinked, confusion flashing across her face. Then her hand darted out, snatching up the papers. Her eyes scanned the pages, the evidence laid bare. No pregnancy. No preparations. No proof. Her face drained of color. Around the table, the realization began to settle like dust. Soft gasps. Sharp looks. And Lisa, the girl who had built a moment on lies, had nowhere left to hide. At first, Lisa tried to laugh it off. She tossed the papers onto the table like they were meaningless, forcing a brittle chuckle. You really went digging through my medical records? She said, voice pitched high with fake outrage. That's illegal, you know. No one laughed with her. No one moved. Ryan stared at her, face pale, his hands clenching into fists on the table. Lisa, he said slowly, voice cracking. Tell the truth. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. For a moment, she seemed to think she could still spin it, that she could weep, make herself the victim, twist the story into something sympathetic. But the room was already turning. Matt's parents sat rigid and silent, disappointment etched into every line of their faces. My parents looked at me, not with pity but with pride. Even Julia, usually the most impulsive of us all, stayed quiet, giving Lisa nothing to fight against. The walls Lisa had built with her lies crumbled one by one, until she stood alone in the wreckage. Finally, she shoved her chair back with a screech and stood. I don't owe you an explanation, she hissed, her voice sharp and venomous. None of you. She grabbed her purse, knocking over a water glass as she stormed away. No one followed. No one called after her. The front door slammed with a hollow finality that seemed to suck the air from the room. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Ryan, poor devastated Ryan, stood up too. Without a word, he walked to the door and left, his shoulders heavy with betrayal. I sat back down, feeling the weight of the morning settle into something solid and irreversible. It was over. Not just the lie. Not just Lisa's ridiculous stunt. The illusion of her. The perfect daughter, the golden sister, the sparkling centerpiece of every room, was gone. And for the first time in years, the family looked around and saw each other clearly. Saw me clearly. Not as an afterthought. Not as a stagehand in someone else's performance. As a woman who had refused to be erased. In the weeks that followed, the dust settled slowly. Lisa didn't apologize. Not to me. Not to Matt. Not even to her own parents. She simply vanished, ghosted from family chats, missing from gatherings, her once commanding presence now just a hollow space no one rushed to fill. Ryan moved out by the end of the month. Julia heard through mutual friends that he filed for divorce quietly, citing irreconcilable differences. Matt and I didn't celebrate her downfall. There was no victory dance, no gloating. Just relief. Relief that we no longer had to twist ourselves into knots to accommodate her chaos. Relief that we had reclaimed our wedding, even if only in spirit. Relief that the truth, at last, belonged to us. The family was different after that. Quieter. Gentler. More real. No more performances at Sunday dinners. No more competing for who could shine the brightest. Just messy, beautiful, imperfect people trying their best to show up for each other. For the first time since I had joined the Bennetts, I felt like I belonged. Not because I had fought for a seat at the table, but because I had stopped shrinking to fit someone else's spotlight. I had built my own light. Steady. Strong. Unshakable. One afternoon, a few months later, Matt and I stood in our backyard under a tangle of fairy lights, grilling burgers with friends, our wedding photo, the real one, untouched by drama, framed proudly in our living room. Julia clinked her beer against mine and smirked. You know, she said, I think you threw a better party taking Lisa down than you did at the reception. I laughed, real and full and free. Because she was wrong. The best thing I did wasn't exposing Lisa. It was choosing myself. Choosing Matt. Choosing truth over appearances, no matter the cost. And that choice had given me more than any applause ever could. It had given me peace. Spring crept into our lives quietly that year. No dramatic announcements. No grand performances. Just slow, steady change, the kind you only notice when you finally stop waiting for the next disaster. Matt and I moved into a new house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy. Just ours. The walls were still bare. The garden needed work. But it felt like home in a way nothing else ever had. On Saturday mornings, we made coffee and wandered through farmers' markets, planning a life that was simple, honest, and fully ours. No more pretending. No more tiptoeing around someone else's need for attention. No more shrinking ourselves to make others comfortable. We had survived the storm. And now we were planting something real in the ruins. One afternoon, while unpacking a box marked Wedding Keepsakes, I found the folded copy of our vows. I sat on the living room floor, the sunlight pooling around me, and read them again. This time not with a lump of sadness in my throat, but with a quiet, fierce joy. Because every word still mattered. Every promise still held. Lisa's lies hadn't changed the truth. They hadn't tainted the love that brought us here. If anything, they had revealed it more clearly. Stripped away the glitter and pretense and forced us to choose each other, again and again. And we had. Without hesitation. Without regret. A few months later, I learned I was pregnant. A real, quiet miracle, not a performance, not a weapon, just life blooming exactly as it was meant to. When we shared the news, it wasn't with a grand announcement or a stolen spotlight. It was with a handful of people gathered around our kitchen table, laughing and crying in equal measure, their joy genuine, their love unconditional. And as I stood there, my hand resting protectively over my stomach, I realized something. New beginnings don't always come with fanfare. Sometimes they come in soft moments. In real promises. In the choice to keep moving forward, no matter who tried to hold you back. And this beginning? It was mine. Finally fully, beautifully mine. At my sister's wedding, she publicly mocked me. Then her groom silenced the whole room. It started with a smile. Emily, the bride, in her lace gown and fresh lip gloss, grinning from behind the microphone like she'd just won something. Before the night slips away, she said, raising her champagne flute, I want to thank everyone who made today so special. The crowd clapped. Cameras clicked. I sat near the head table, smiling too. Automatically. My amazing parents, our friends, the bridal party, and of course my older sister, Alyssa, who has always been my. She paused for effect. Emotional support animal. Laughter. Quick. Sharp. Loud enough to echo. I froze. My smile stayed put, but my jaw twitched. Did she really just say that? No, seriously. Emily went on, her voice syrupy sweet. She's always been there, through breakups, meltdowns, questionable haircuts. Bless her heart, she's always felt things so deeply. More laughter. My stomach dropped. I caught our mother's glance across the room. That tight. Just go with it. Smile she'd used every time Emily crossed a line and expected everyone to applaud. She's also the reason I know not to trust Amazon reviews, Emily continued. Remember the bridesmaid shoes, Liz? Size 8 my ass. The table roared. I blinked. There it was, the public teardown dressed as a toast. A backhanded highlight reel of my worst moments disguised as bridal banter. I glanced at Emily's new husband, Daniel. He wasn't laughing. He was watching me. My hands were folded neatly in my lap, napkin creased perfectly, wine glass still full. I didn't say a word. But honestly, Emily said, softening her tone, Alyssa, you've always been my rock. Even when you were a little intense. And I mean that in the best possible way. Everyone chuckled again. I stayed still, tension humming under my skin like static. She ended with a wink. Here's to my sister. May she find someone who loves her, almost as much as she loves overthinking. Another wave of laughter. Another camera flash. And then it was done. She handed the mic back to the DJ and floated toward Daniel like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just used her wedding toast to serve up years of unresolved rivalry in front of everyone we knew. And me. I sat there, smiling. Because that's what you do when your sister uses you for a punchline in chiffon. But what Emily didn't see, or maybe didn't care to, was that someone else had been watching the whole time. And he wasn't smiling. Emily was always the star. That's not bitterness. It's just fact. Even as kids, She walked into a room like she expected applause. And most of the time, she got it. She was the one who won the spelling bees, landed the school play roles, got her picture framed in the orthodontist's office. And I was the quiet one, the reliable one, the sister who made flashcards and ironed costumes. Our parents used to say we balanced each other out, which really meant I filled in the gaps she left behind. Emily would forget to call Grandma. I'd send flowers. She'd flake on Thanksgiving prep. I'd show up early and bake an extra pie, then say Emily made it when someone asked. That's just how it was. She loved attention. I didn't. She needed the spotlight. I made sure the lights worked. Even into adulthood, nothing changed. Emily called me her emotional anchor. Mostly when she needed to vent about her job, her friends, her dating life. I was the one who answered every 1 a.m. call, calmed every crisis, and talked her down from every breakup. And when she met Daniel, I was thrilled for her. He was quiet, grounded, kind. The kind of man who didn't need to be the loudest in the room. The kind of man who made Emily slow down, just a little. I liked him. Still do. At least, I did until I realized how little he knew about what it meant to stand next to a woman like Emily. She could be dazzling, fun, effortless. But when it came to family, she didn't share the stage. I figured things might change with the wedding. That maybe being a bride would bring out something softer in her. That maybe, after all the support, she'd finally see me as more than her emotional convenience. I helped with the vendor calls, made her emergency kit, sewed the tear in her veil the morning of the wedding, while she FaceTimed her friends and called herself the calmest bride in history. I didn't ask for thanks. I just hoped for kindness. And then she stood up in front of everyone and reminded me that kindness was never her currency. If you looked closely at that wedding, the color palette, the florals, the seating chart that somehow kept Cousin Leo and his ex-wife at opposite ends of the room, you'd see me. My fingerprints were everywhere. Emily didn't have the patience for details. She had the vision, the Pinterest board, the folder full of aesthetic ideas. But execution? That was mine. I handled the bakery when the first cake designer ghosted her. Negotiated with the venue after she forgot to sign the contract and almost lost her deposit. Wrangled the last-minute bridesmaid dress order when her best friend switched sizes 2 weeks out. I spent hours building her wedding playlist, and then spent more hours editing it after she said the vibe was too old millennial. I even dealt with the florist after Emily called crying because the roses were the wrong shade of blush. She never said thank you. But that was okay. I wasn't doing it for applause. I just wanted the day to go smoothly. For her. I told myself it was her nerves. That she was overwhelmed. That once the day came, she'd see everything I did, and maybe for once see me. But when she stood on that mic and turned me into a punchline, I realized. She had seen me. She saw how much I gave, how steady I stayed, how invisible I made myself to keep the peace. And she banked on it. She knew I wouldn't fight back. Not at her wedding. Not in front of everyone. So she took the spotlight and made sure I stayed in the shadows. Even when the spotlight should have been shared, if just for a moment. Even when I had done everything behind the scenes to keep her day from falling apart. She didn't just forget me. She weaponized me. This wasn't the first time Emily made me the punchline. It was just the first time she did it in a white dress. When we were kids, she used to call me the echo. Because I repeated things. Because I followed her around. Because I wanted to be near the sun. She'd say it in front of her friends. Don't mind my echo, she just repeats what I say. And I'd laugh. Because I didn't know better. Because I thought that was sisterhood. At my own high school graduation party, she gave a toast, something sweet, I thought. She told everyone that I was the hardest worker she knew. Even though she once cried over getting a B+ in gym. People laughed. I laughed. But I didn't forget. At my birthday brunch the year I turned 30, she brought a framed photo from our awkward teen years. Proof she wasn't always this pretty, she said, holding it up. Another round of laughter. She always said it with a smile. Always knew how to coat her cruelty in sugar. So people excused it. It's just her sense of humor. That's just how Emily is. You know she doesn't mean anything by it. But that's the thing. She did mean it. She meant to make sure I stayed a step behind. Meant to remind everyone who the favorite was, even if no one said the word out loud. And I let her. Because calling it out made me the sensitive one. Because refusing to laugh meant I couldn't take a joke. Because pushing back was too much work in a family where appearances were everything. So I smiled. I laughed. I let her have it. Until the wedding. Until that toast. Until she stood in front of 100 people, called me her emotional support animal, and expected me to smile through that, too. And maybe I would have. Maybe I would have swallowed it again, if it weren't for what happened next. The music started again like nothing had happened. The DJ didn't miss a beat. He hit play on some crowd-pleasing top 40 hit, and people moved like the toast hadn't happened. Like my dignity hadn't just been gift-wrapped and served up between salad and the entree. Emily beamed. She twirled on the dance floor, clutching her bouquet in one hand, waving to our aunts with the other. The center of every conversation. The star of every phone camera. But I stayed in my seat. I tried not to blink too much, worried that if I did, the tears would show up before I could stop them. That was a choice, someone muttered behind me. I didn't turn around. Our mom came over to refill her champagne and touched my shoulder like it was enough. "You know your sister," she whispered. "She didn't mean anything by it, didn't she?" Emily always didn't mean it. Always walked the line between cruel and cute. Always got away with it because she smiled and everyone wanted to stay on her good side. But then I felt a presence behind me. Daniel, Emily's groom. I hadn't spoken to him much that day, not because we weren't close, but because he'd been busy being, well, the groom. But now he stood behind my chair, his hand on the backrest, quiet. "Hey," he said, low enough for only me to hear. I looked up. His jaw was set. "You okay?" I nodded. "You sure?" I nodded again. Not because it was true, but because I didn't want to take up space. He watched me for another beat. "That wasn't cool," he said. "She crossed a line." I blinked. Because Daniel had always been gentle. Observant. Quiet. Kind. But not this kind of assertive. "You don't need to say anything," I told him. "It's her day." He didn't reply right away. Just looked toward the dance floor. "Doesn't mean she gets to bulldoze people." He turned and walked away before I could answer. And I didn't know it at the time. But that wasn't the last time he'd speak up. Daniel wasn't the type to raise his voice. He didn't need to. He had that calm, composed presence that filled a space without shouting. The kind of man who didn't speak often. But when he did, you listened. And when he took the mic at the end of the night, everyone expected a sweet little thank you. What they got was something else. He stood near the sweetheart table, holding a glass of champagne in one hand and the mic in the other. He smiled at Emily first. "Before we wrap up this night," he said, "I just want to say a few words." Emily beamed. She looked at him like he was about to gush about how beautiful she looked, how perfect the day had been. "Today has been incredible," he said. "The food, the music, the people. I'm so grateful to all of you who helped make it happen." Polite applause. "But there's something I can't let slide." The room quieted. "I've spent the last year getting to know not just my wife," he continued, glancing at Emily again, "but the people closest to her." I sat still. My breath caught, not in panic but in anticipation. "And there's someone here who has given more than anyone else, not just to this wedding, but to this family." He looked toward me. Direct. Steady. "Alyssa, you've shown up every step of the way. You handled details none of us wanted to think about. You did the thankless work with grace." Emily's smile faltered. "You were insulted tonight. Publicly. Jokingly, maybe. But I saw it. And I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen." Now the room was frozen. No laughter. No music. No glasses clinking. "Kindness isn't a party trick," he said. "It's not optional. Especially not with family." He raised his glass. "To the person who reminded me what grace under pressure looks like, and what it means to be quietly powerful." He looked at me one more time. "Alyssa, thank you." And just like that, he set the mic down and walked off the stage. You could hear the silence. That heavy kind of quiet where forks hang in midair, where phones stay face down, where nobody knows what expression they're supposed to wear. Emily stood frozen beside the cake table, still holding her bouquet, still smiling barely, but her eyes were darting, scanning the room for support, for validation, for someone to laugh and break the tension. No one did. Daniel had returned to his seat and was casually sipping champagne, as if he hadn't just flipped the script on the entire night. My heart was pounding, not from embarrassment, but from something else. Something sharper. Relief. For once, someone else had called it out. And not just anyone, him. The one she'd married. The one she thought would join in on the performance. Instead, he dismantled it. Quietly. Calmly. Completely. I could feel eyes turning toward me. Not pitying. Not uncomfortable. Just different. Like people were seeing me for the first time without the distortion of Emily's lens. Across the room, our mother looked like she might pass out. I could practically hear her inner monologue. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't part of the plan. Because when Emily controlled the room stayed safe. Pretty. Polished. Scripted. But now, the script was burning. And she had no idea what to do. She leaned over to whisper something to her maid of honor. Their heads close, the fake laugh too loud, but it didn't land. The energy had shifted. This wasn't her moment anymore. It belonged to someone else. And she knew it. By morning, Emily had already started rewriting the story. She posted a carousel of wedding photos on Instagram. Her twirling in the dress, the cake cutting, a blurry selfie with Daniel at the altar. The caption? What a magical night, two hearts, laughter, love, and a little light roasting. Couldn't have asked for more. #blessed, #bridal banter, #sister love. Sister love. Like what she did on that mic was bonding. Like turning me into a character from her one-woman show was just playful affection. She even tagged me. I didn't like the post. Didn't comment. Didn't share. Neither did Daniel. That part was telling. In fact, I noticed Daniel hadn't commented on any of her photos that morning. No reposts. No heart eye emojis. No "I'm the luckiest guy in the world" captions. Just silence. I didn't hear from Emily until 2 days later. A text. So I guess you're still mad, face with rolling eyes. I was joking, Alyssa. It was my wedding. Sorry you didn't get the attention for once. That was the line she chose. Not "I'm sorry." Not "I went too far." Not even "Did I hurt you?" Just a reminder that the day was about her. And a jab to let me know that anything I felt was just insecurity. Classic Emily. But she didn't expect what came next. The family chat was lighting up, mostly about how unexpected Daniel's speech had been. My aunt wrote, "I thought it was so graceful. Took guts." My cousin replied, "I didn't realize how much Alyssa did for the wedding until he said that." Someone even sent a photo me, sitting quietly with my napkin in my lap while Emily spoke into the mic with one hand on her hip. Side by side, the contrast was obvious. And Emily? She'd been watching it all unfold. 1 hour later, her Instagram post was gone. Deleted. No explanation. No new caption. Just erased, like if she hit backspace enough times, maybe the memory of that night would vanish too. But memories don't work that way. Especially not when the truth already has witnesses. Emily's next message came the following evening. This one was longer. More polished. Like she'd been workshopping it in her head all day. "Hey, I've been thinking about everything. I really didn't mean for you to feel hurt. You know I love you. I just thought we were the kind of sisters who could laugh at ourselves. I guess I misread that. If you want to talk, I'm open." It was the closest thing to accountability I'd ever gotten from her. And still, she didn't apologize. Not directly. Not for the toast. Not for the years before it. It was classic Emily diplomacy. Say something just close enough to sorry that she could point to it later and say, "I tried." I sat with the message for a while. Read it twice. Then I typed 4 words. "He saw me, Em," and sent it. No punctuation. No softening. No invitation to discuss. Because that was the truth. Daniel had seen me. Not the curated version Emily presented to the world. Not the helper. The sidekick. The convenient emotional sponge. He saw me fully. And in front of everyone, he chose not to ignore that. He chose me. Not over her. But beside her. And that was the part she couldn't stand. Because for the first time in her life, the room didn't orbit her. It paused. Pivoted. And looked my way. Emily didn't respond to the message. But I know she read it. I know because hours later, her Facebook relationship status disappeared. Her honeymoon post stopped. And in the wedding recap album she posted later that week, Daniel's speech was left out entirely. Like it never happened. But it did. And even without a microphone. So did I. 3 months later, someone brought it up at a baby shower. We were passing around tiny onesies and fruit skewers when a friend of a friend, someone I barely knew, leaned over and said, "Wait, you're that Alyssa, right? The sister from the wedding." I blinked. "The one Daniel toasted at the end? That was you." I nodded slowly. She grinned. "That was iconic. I've never seen a groom do something like that. So classy. And honestly, you didn't flinch. Respect." I smiled. Not out of pride. Out of peace. Because I hadn't told that story. I hadn't corrected the narrative. I hadn't defended myself online or replied to Emily's half-hearted outreach. I'd just lived. And somehow that had been enough. People saw. Even the ones I didn't think were paying attention. I heard from my aunt that Emily and Daniel were working on things. Apparently the honeymoon was short. Literally and figuratively. He'd started pulling away. Not out of cruelty, just clarity. He wasn't built for performance. He didn't want a partner who needed a spotlight. He wanted one who could share the light. And Emily? She still hadn't learned how to step out of center frame. We haven't talked much. She sends a birthday text, a Christmas card with a dog I didn't know she adopted, and one random meme months later with a caption that read, "This is so you LOL." I didn't reply. Not out of spite, out of self-respect. Because closure didn't come with a dramatic scene or a full-circle apology. It came in a quiet room, in a moment when someone remembered what mattered. And they remembered me, not as a side character, not as a setup to someone else's punchline, but as the person who sat in grace and still stood taller than the mic.
She left me at the altar, so I married her sister. I never thought I'd be the guy who got left at the altar. But there I was, standing at the front of a sunlit chapel, my heart pounding, my palms sweating, my mind racing as the minutes slipped by, each second stretching into an eternity of whispered questions and silent, unspoken fears. The guests shifted in their seats, their eyes flicking nervously between the empty doorway and the tight, strained expression on my face. Their murmured conversations slipping through the cracks in the heavy, wooden pews. Their whispers echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings like the soft, steady thrum of a distant, approaching storm. I felt my fingers curl into fists at my sides, my nails biting into my palms. The sharp, stinging ache of anxiety twisting into something darker. Something colder. Something that felt a lot like fear. I glanced over at my best man, Ryan. His jaw tight. His eyes wide. His hands fidgeting nervously at his sides as he leaned in. His breath warm against my ear as he whispered, "Maybe she's just stuck in traffic, man. You know how these things go. Brides are always late. It's a thing." I forced a small, tight smile. Nodded. Tried to convince myself that he was right. That I was overreacting. That I was letting my own insecurities twist the moment into something darker. Something more dangerous. Something that felt a lot like a warning. But as the minutes stretched into hours, as the soft, steady hum of whispered conversations grew louder, as the nervous, anxious glances from my family and friends grew sharper, I felt the first, sharp sting of betrayal creep into my chest. The slow, creeping certainty that something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. The organist played the processional for the second time. The slow, mournful notes slipping through the air like a whispered funeral dirge. The slow, steady pulse of grief echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings as I stood there. Alone. Abandoned. Humiliated. And then, finally, mercifully, Ryan leaned in again. His jaw tight. His eyes wide. His voice low. His words slipping from his lips like a small, whispered confession. "She's not coming, man," he said. His voice tight. His tone sharp. The small, breathless hiss of a man who has already realized the truth. Who has already felt the first, sharp sting of his carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. She's not coming. And in that moment, I felt my heart crack open. Felt the small, sharp pieces of my carefully constructed life shatter around me. Felt the slow, steady ache of betrayal slip into my chest like a blade. Sharp and cold and impossible to ignore. She had left me. And I had never seen it coming. The days that followed felt like moving through a fog. Each hour stretching into an endless, blurred smear of whispered questions and half-formed regrets. Each moment slipping past in a slow, steady pulse of pain and humiliation. I hadn't known what to do when I left the chapel that day. My suit jacket still clinging to my shoulders. My tie still knotted tightly around my throat. My mind still struggling to process the slow, creeping reality of what had just happened. Ryan had driven me home. His jaw tight. His hands gripping the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity that felt like a silent, unspoken promise. A quiet, whispered reminder that he was still on my side. That he was still my friend. That he was still willing to stand by me even as my world crumbled around me. But even his presence, even his quiet, unspoken loyalty, hadn't been enough to fill the empty, aching spaces in my heart. The sharp, stinging cracks that had formed in the carefully constructed life I had built around myself. The small, whispered fragments of a future that had shattered beneath the weight of my fiancée's betrayal. I had spent the first night alone in my dark, empty apartment. The ring still warm against my palm. The small, shining symbol of a promise that had never been kept. The small, whispered reminder of a love that had never really existed. I had thrown it across the room at some point, my fingers clenching into fists at my sides. My breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps as I watched the tiny, sparkling band bounce off the wall. Watched it clatter against the hardwood floor. Watched it roll into the dark, forgotten corners of my life, disappearing into the shadows like a small, whispered secret. I had deleted her number from my phone, erased our messages, scrubbed her photos from my social media, tried to wipe every trace of her from my life like dirt beneath my fingernails. Tried to convince myself that I was moving on, that I was letting go, that I was choosing myself over the fragile, crumbling remains of a relationship that had never really been mine. But the truth was, I hadn't moved on. I hadn't let go. I hadn't chosen myself. I had just gone numb. Had just buried the pain beneath a thin, polished veneer of anger and bitterness and quiet, simmering resentment. Had just wrapped myself in a shell of cold, unbreakable resolve. And as the days stretched into weeks, as the small, whispered fragments of my life began to slip through my fingers, I felt the first, sharp sting of something darker. Something colder. Something that felt a lot like revenge. It was a chance encounter. The kind of unexpected, awkward moment that feels like a punch to the gut. That catches you off guard. That leaves you scrambling for words. That forces you to confront the ghosts of the past you've been trying so hard to forget. I hadn't seen Lily in months. Not since the wedding. Not since her sister had left me standing at the altar. Alone and humiliated. My heart shattered. My pride in pieces. My carefully constructed life slipping through my fingers like sand. I had been standing in line at a small, corner cafe, my mind already drifting to the long list of tasks waiting for me at the office. My eyes flicking over the soft, flickering glow of the pastries in the glass display case. The small, whispered promises of comfort slipping through the warm, fragrant air. And then I heard her voice. Soft. Breathless. Familiar. Daniel? I felt my heart stutter in my chest. My breath catching in my throat. My fingers tightening around the thin, plastic strap of my laptop bag as I turned. My eyes locking with hers for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. She looked different. Tired. A little thinner. Her dark hair pulled back into a loose, messy bun. Her eyes wide. Her lips parted in a small, surprised gasp as she took a small, hesitant step toward me. Her hands slipping into the pockets of her faded denim jacket. Her shoulders hunching slightly as if she were bracing herself for a blow. Lily, I said. My voice low. My tone steady. The small, tight flicker of something dangerous slipping into my expression as I took a small, deliberate step closer. My pulse quickening. My heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I tried to read the tight set of her jaw. The small, dark flicker of something like guilt in her eyes. For a moment, neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. We just stood there. The quiet, steady hum of the cafe slipping around us like a whispered secret. The soft, steady pulse of the espresso machine thrumming in the background like a slow, steady heartbeat. And then, finally, mercifully, she broke the silence. Her voice low. Her tone tight. The small, breathless hiss of a woman who has already realized the truth. Who has already felt the first, sharp sting of her carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. I didn't expect to see you here, she said. Her eyes flicking to the side. Her jaw clenching. her chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths as she forced herself to meet my gaze. As she tried to summon the same, polished confidence she had once used to disarm me. To lull me into a false sense of security. To convince me that she was nothing more than the quiet, supportive sister in the background of my shattered love story. "Yeah," I said. My voice tight. My tone sharp. The small, breathless hiss of a man who has already realized the truth. Who has already felt the first, sharp sting of his carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. Neither did I. And in that moment, I felt the first small flicker of something new. Something sharp. Something dangerous. Something that felt a lot like hope. Seeing Lily again stirred up old wounds. The kind of deep, jagged scars that never really heal. That linger just beneath the surface. That throb with a dull, aching pain whenever the weather changes. Whenever the light hits them just right. Whenever the ghosts of the past slip back into your life unannounced. I hadn't expected to see her again. Hadn't planned on reopening the small, whispered fragments of my broken heart. Hadn't prepared myself for the quiet, simmering pain that bloomed in my chest the moment I heard her voice. The small, breathless hiss of a woman who had once been nothing more than a background character in the story of my shattered engagement. I spent the rest of the day in a fog. My mind drifting back to the small, awkward exchange at the cafe. The soft, breathless tremor in Lily's voice. The small, tight flicker of guilt in her eyes. The way her hands had twisted nervously in the pockets of her jacket. The way her lips had pressed into a thin, tight line as she forced herself to meet my gaze. I tried to shake it off. Tried to convince myself that it didn't matter. That she didn't matter. That I had moved on. That I had let go. That I had left the small, shattered pieces of my broken heart behind me when I had walked out of that chapel. When I had stepped out into the harsh, unforgiving light of a world that had suddenly felt too bright. Too loud. Too sharp. But the truth was, I hadn't moved on. I hadn't let go. I hadn't healed. I had just buried the pain beneath a thin, polished veneer of anger and bitterness and quiet, simmering resentment. Had just wrapped myself in a shell of cold, unbreakable resolve. Had just convinced myself that I was stronger than I really was. And as the days stretched into weeks, as the small, whispered fragments of my broken heart slipped through my fingers, as the quiet, unspoken promises of a life I had never really lived haunted my every waking thought, I felt the first, sharp sting of something darker. Something colder. Something that felt a lot like regret. I hadn't just lost my fiancée that day. I had lost my faith in love. My trust in people. My belief in the quiet, whispered promises of forever. And as the days slipped past, as the small, whispered fragments of my life continued to slip through my fingers, I found myself wondering if I would ever really heal. If I would ever really let go. If I would ever really move on from the small, shattered pieces of my broken heart. It didn't take long for our paths to cross again. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. A small, whispered reminder that the world is smaller than we like to believe. That the threads of our lives are more tightly woven than we realize. That the past has a way of creeping back into the present when we least expect it. I saw her a few days later. Standing at the corner of Main and Fifth. Her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. Her fingers wrapped around the thin, black strap of a canvas tote bag. Her eyes fixed on the small, glowing screen of her phone. Her lips pressed into a thin, tight line as she waited for the light to change. I hesitated. My heart stuttering in my chest. My pulse quickening. My mind racing as I tried to decide what to do. Whether to cross the street and pretend not to see her. To slip past her like a ghost. To let the small, whispered fragments of our shared history slip back into the shadows where they belonged. But then she looked up. Her eyes locking with mine. Her lips parting in a small, surprised gasp. Her shoulders stiffening. Her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag as the light changed. As the small, tightly wound knot of pedestrians around her began to move. as the city slipped back into motion around us. "Daniel," she said, her voice low, her tone steady. The small, tight flicker of something dangerous slipping into her expression as she took a small, hesitant step toward me. Her eyes wide. Her lips pressed into a thin, tight line as she forced herself to meet my gaze. As she tried to summon the same, polished confidence she had once used to disarm me. To lull me into a false sense of security. To convince me that she was nothing more than the quiet, supportive sister in the background of my shattered love story. "Lily," I said. My voice low. My tone steady. The small, tight flicker of something dangerous slipping into my expression as I took a small, deliberate step closer. My pulse quickening. My heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I tried to read the tight set of her jaw. The small, dark flicker of something like guilt in her eyes. For a moment, neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. We just stood there. The soft, steady hum of the city slipping around us like a whispered secret. The quiet, unspoken tension of 1,000 small, whispered regrets hanging in the air between us. And then, finally, mercifully, she broke the silence. Her voice low. Her tone tight. The small, breathless hiss of a woman who has already realized the truth. Who has already felt the first, sharp sting of her carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. "It's good to see you," she said. Her eyes flicking to the side. Her jaw clenching. Her chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths as she forced herself to meet my gaze. As she tried to summon the same, polished confidence she had once used to disarm me. To lull me into a false sense of security. To convince me that she was nothing more than the quiet, supportive sister in the background of my shattered love story. And in that moment, I felt the first small flicker of something new. Something sharp. Something dangerous. Something that felt a lot like hope. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic, earth-shattering moment. No sudden, breathless realization. No whispered confession in the dark. Just a slow, quiet shift. A gradual, almost imperceptible change that felt like the turning of a tide. The slow, steady pull of a current that I hadn't even realized I had been fighting against. It started with the small things. The way Lily smiled when she thought no one was watching. The soft, unguarded curve of her lips. The quiet, breathless tremor of a woman who had never really learned how to fake it. Who had never mastered the art of the carefully constructed, polished, picture-perfect facade her sister had worn like armor. Or the way she laughed. Her head tipped back. Her eyes bright. Her voice slipping through the crowded rooms of family gatherings like a slow, steady pulse of warmth and light. The kind of easy, unguarded laugh that felt like a warm, steady exhale after months of holding my breath. Or the way she listened. The way she tilted her head to the side when someone spoke. The way her eyes narrowed. The small, thoughtful crease that formed between her brows as she tried to piece together the small, whispered fragments of a conversation. The small, quiet act of attention that felt like a whispered promise. Like a small, unspoken reminder that she was really, truly listening. I started to notice the small, subtle ways she was different from her sister. The way she preferred quiet, intimate gatherings to the loud, chaotic swirl of dinner parties and black-tie galas. The way she chose comfort over fashion. The soft, worn denim jackets and faded, oversized sweaters that felt like small, whispered confessions of a woman who had never really felt the need to impress anyone. The way she wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. Her fingers curling into the warm, ceramic surface like a small, whispered prayer. The slow, steady pulse of a woman who had never really learned how to let go. And slowly, the small, whispered fragments of my shattered heart began to slip back into place. The small, jagged pieces of my broken life began to form something new. Something sharp. Something dangerous. Something that felt a lot like hope. I hadn't planned on falling for her. Hadn't even realized it was happening. Hadn't even noticed the slow, steady pull of the current until I was already too far gone. until I was already caught in the quiet, unbreakable grip of a woman who had once been nothing more than the background character in the story of my shattered love. But as the days stretched into weeks, as the small, whispered fragments of our lives began to slip together, I felt the first real flicker of something new. Something sharp. Something dangerous. Something that felt a lot like love. It happened on a rainy Thursday. The kind of cold, gray day that clings to your skin. That seeps into your bones. That makes the world feel small and sharp and unforgiving. We had met for coffee. The small, corner cafe that had become our unofficial meeting place. The one with the flickering neon sign and the chipped, mismatched mugs. The one that always smelled like freshly ground beans and warm, melted butter. The one that felt like a small, whispered refuge from the chaos of the outside world. She had been sitting in our usual corner booth. Her fingers wrapped tightly around the chipped, ceramic handle of her mug. Her eyes fixed on the small, swirling vortex of steam rising from the surface of her coffee. Her shoulders hunched. Her posture stiff. The small, tight flicker of something dangerous lurking just beneath the surface. I slid into the seat across from her. My jacket still damp from the rain. My pulse quickening. My heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I tried to read the tight set of her jaw. The small, dark flicker of something like fear in her eyes. She didn't look up when I sat down. Didn't offer the small, tight smile she had once used to disarm me. To lull me into a false sense of security. To convince me that she was nothing more than the quiet, supportive sister in the background of my shattered love story. I hesitated. My fingers curling into fists beneath the table. My breath catching in my throat. My mind racing as I tried to decide what to say. What to do. How to bridge the small, yawning gap that had formed between us in the weeks since our paths had first crossed again. But then, finally, mercifully, she broke the silence. Her voice low. Her tone tight. The small, breathless hiss of a woman who has already realized the truth. Who has already felt the first, sharp sting of her carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. I need to tell you something, she said. Her eyes still fixed on her coffee. Her fingers tightening around the handle of her mug. Her jaw clenching. Her chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths as she forced herself to speak. As she forced herself to pull the small, whispered fragments of her secret from the dark, hidden corners of her mind. I felt my pulse quicken. My heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I leaned in. My eyes locking with hers. My breath catching in my throat as I tried to read the tight set of her jaw. The small, dark flicker of something like fear in her eyes. I never wanted her to marry you, she whispered. Her voice low. Her tone sharp. The small, breathless hiss of a woman who has already realized the truth. Who has already felt the first, sharp sting of her carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. I never thought she deserved you. I never thought she loved you. I never thought you belonged together. I never wanted you to get hurt. And in that moment, I felt the first, sharp sting of something new. Something sharp. Something dangerous. Something that felt a lot like hope. Her words hung in the air between us. Sharp and heavy. Like the slow, steady pulse of a distant, approaching storm. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My pulse quicken. My heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I tried to process the quiet, breathless confession that had slipped from her lips. The small, whispered fragments of a truth I had never really let myself believe. I never thought she deserved you. The words echoed in my mind. Slipped through the cracks in my carefully constructed defenses. Wrapped themselves around my better judgment like a slowly tightening noose. For a moment, neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. We just sat there. The soft, steady hum of the cafe slipping around us like a whispered secret. The small, tight flicker of something dangerous slipping into the air between us. Finally, mercifully, Lily broke the silence. Her voice low. her tone tight. The small, breathless hiss of a woman who has already realized the truth. Who has already felt the first, sharp sting of her carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes flicking to the side, her jaw clenching, her chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths as she forced herself to meet my gaze. As she tried to summon the same, polished confidence she had once used to disarm me, to lull me into a false sense of security, to convince me that she was nothing more than the quiet, supportive sister in the background of my shattered love story. I didn't mean to say that. I didn't mean to make things weird. I've been holding that in for a long time. I hesitated, my fingers curling into fists beneath the table, my mind racing, my pulse quickening, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I tried to decide what to say, what to do, how to bridge the small, yawning gap that had formed between us in the long, silent months since my world had come crashing down around me. But then, finally, mercifully, I found my voice, my words slipping from my lips in a small, breathless whisper. The slow, steady pulse of a man who has already realized the truth, who has already felt the first, sharp sting of his carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. "Don't apologize," I said, my voice low, my tone steady, the small, tight flicker of something dangerous slipping into my expression as I leaned in, my eyes locking with hers, my breath catching in my throat as I tried to read the tight set of her jaw, the small, dark flicker of something like fear in her eyes. "You don't have to be sorry. You're just being honest." And honestly, I think I needed to hear it. She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the side, her jaw clenching, her chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths as she tried to read the tight set of my jaw, the small, dark flicker of something like hope in my eyes. And in that moment, I felt the first, sharp sting of something new. Something sharp. Something dangerous. Something that felt a lot like love. I hadn't seen her in nearly a year. Hadn't even thought about her in months. Had convinced myself that I had moved on. That I had let go. That I had left the small, shattered pieces of my broken heart behind me when I had walked out of that chapel. When I had stepped out into the harsh, unforgiving light of a world that had suddenly felt too bright. Too loud. Too sharp. But then, one night, while I was sitting at the bar of the small, corner pub where Lily and I had met for drinks a dozen times, where we had spent long, lazy evenings laughing over shared appetizers and half-empty glasses of wine, I saw her. She slipped through the door, her hair pulled back into a tight, polished ponytail, her dress clinging to her curves, her heels clicking sharply against the worn, wooden floor, her eyes flicking around the room like a predator searching for prey. The small, tight flicker of something dangerous slipping into her expression as she slipped into the empty barstool beside me. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my pulse quicken, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I tried to process the quiet, breathless shock of seeing her again. The small, whispered fragments of a past I had tried so hard to forget slipping back into my life unannounced. She turned to me, her lips curling into a small, tight smile, her eyes narrowing, the small, sharp flicker of something like regret slipping into her expression as she leaned in, her breath warm against my ear, her voice low, her tone tight, the small, breathless hiss of a woman who has already realized the truth, who has already felt the first, sharp sting of her carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice low, her tone sharp, the small, breathless hiss of a woman who has already realized the truth, who has already felt the first, sharp sting of her carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. "It's been a long time." I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the cool, glass surface of my beer, my mind racing, my pulse quickening, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I tried to decide what to say, what to do, how to bridge the small, yawning gap that had formed between us in the long, silent months since my world had come crashing down around me. But then, finally, mercifully, I found my voice, my words slipping from my lips in a small, breathless whisper. The slow, steady pulse of a man who has already realized the truth, who has already felt the first, sharp sting of his carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. It has, I said. My voice low. My tone steady. The small, tight flicker of something dangerous slipping into my expression as I leaned back. My eyes locking with hers. My breath catching in my throat as I tried to read the tight set of her jaw. The small, dark flicker of something like fear in her eyes. Long enough for me to move on. Long enough for me to let go. Long enough for me to realize that I deserved better. She flinched, her eyes flicking to the side, her jaw clenching, her chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths as she forced herself to meet my gaze. As she tried to summon the same, polished confidence she had once used to disarm me, to lull me into a false sense of security, to convince me that she was still in control. But the truth was, she wasn't. Not anymore. Not ever again. The confrontation with my ex stirred up more than just old memories. It cracked open old wounds, ripped the scabs from half-healed scars, sent small, sharp fragments of my broken heart clattering to the floor around me like shattered glass. I spent the next few days in a fog, my mind slipping back into the small, dark corners of the past, replaying the quiet, breathless moments of my failed engagement, the whispered promises, the unspoken regrets, the small, whispered fragments of a future that had never really been mine. I hadn't realized how deeply the past still had its claws in me, how tightly I had clung to the small, jagged pieces of a love that had never really existed, how much of my heart was still wrapped up in the ghost of a woman who had walked out of my life without a backward glance. But then, one rainy Friday evening, as I sat alone in my dark, empty apartment, the soft, steady hum of the rain slipping through the cracks in my windows, the slow, steady pulse of my own heartbeat echoing in my ears, my phone buzzed. I glanced down, my eyes flicking to the glowing screen, my pulse quickening, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I read the name that had slipped into my life like a small, whispered promise. The quiet, unspoken breath of fresh air that had pulled me out of the fog of my broken heart and back into the bright, unbreakable light of the present. Lily. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the cool, glass surface of my phone, my mind racing, my pulse quickening, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I tried to decide what to do, what this meant, what the small, whispered fragment of a connection might reveal. I swiped the screen, lifted the phone to my ear, my breath catching in my throat as I whispered her name. The small, tight flicker of something dangerous slipping into my expression as I tried to read the tight set of my jaw. The small, dark flicker of something like hope in my eyes. Daniel, she said, her voice low, her tone steady. The small, breathless hiss of a woman who has already realized the truth, who has already felt the first, sharp sting of her carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. Can we meet for coffee? I need to talk to you. I felt my jaw clench, my teeth grinding together as her words settled into the space between us. As the full weight of her request crashed down around me like a wave, cold and sharp and impossible to ignore. And in that moment, I realized I had a choice to make. I could cling to the past, wrap myself in the small, shattered pieces of a broken love that had never really existed, bury myself beneath the weight of my own regrets and whispered promises. Or I could choose Lily. Choose the woman who had pulled me out of the darkness, who had whispered small, breathless promises of a future I had never dared to imagine, who had reminded me that there was still light in the world, still hope, still love. And as the rain continued to fall, as the small, whispered fragments of my shattered heart slipped back into place, I found my answer. I found my choice. I found my future. The day of the wedding felt different this time. Not just because it was a smaller, more intimate affair. Not just because the guest list was shorter. The flowers less extravagant. The venue quieter. The air lighter. But because this time, I felt ready. I stood in front of the small, sunlit chapel, my hands wrapped tightly around the smooth, polished surface of the wooden railing. My pulse steady. My breath calm. My heart full. I glanced down at my hands. At the small, gold band resting against my palm. At the small, shining symbol of a promise I had never thought I would make again. At the small, whispered reminder of a love that had felt impossible, unattainable, unreal. But it was real. Lily had made it real. Had taken the small, shattered pieces of my broken heart and slipped them back into place. Had wrapped her hands around the jagged edges and pulled them together. Had whispered small, breathless promises of forever into the dark, hidden corners of my soul. Had reminded me that I was still capable of love. That I was still capable of trust. That I was still capable of hope. The soft, steady hum of the organ slipped through the open doors of the chapel. The slow, steady pulse of a wedding march echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. The small, whispered promise of a new beginning slipping through the cool, polished air. I straightened. My shoulders back. My head high. My heart steady. My pulse calm as the small, polished wooden doors at the back of the chapel creaked open. As the soft, golden light of the setting sun spilled through the doorway. As the small, delicate figure of the woman I loved stepped into the light. Lily. Her hair loose around her shoulders. Her dress simple. Elegant. Her smile wide. Her eyes bright. The small, tight flicker of something like hope slipping into her expression as she took a small, hesitant step forward. As she moved through the small, scattered crowd of family and friends. As she made her way down the short, narrow aisle toward the man who had chosen her. Who had loved her. Who had never once doubted the quiet, unspoken promise of a future they had whispered into the dark, hidden corners of their hearts. She reached me. Her fingers slipping into mine. Her breath warm against my cheek as she leaned in. Her voice low. Her tone steady. The small, breathless hiss of a woman who has already realized the truth. Who has already felt the first, sharp sting of her carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. I love you, she whispered. Her eyes locking with mine. Her lips curling into a small, tight smile. Her chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths as she slipped the small, gold band onto my finger. As she whispered the small, breathless promise of forever into the cool, polished air of the small, sunlit chapel. And in that moment, I felt the first, sharp sting of something new. Something sharp. Something dangerous. Something that felt a lot like forever. I never thought I'd be the guy who got left at the altar. But I also never thought I'd be the guy who found love again. Who picked up the small, shattered pieces of his broken heart and built something new. Something real. Something unbreakable. As I stood beside Lily on the small, sunlit balcony of our honeymoon suite, my arm wrapped loosely around her waist, my fingers curled into the soft, warm fabric of her dress, my heart steady in my chest, my pulse calm, my mind clear, I felt the first real flicker of contentment bloom in my chest. The slow, steady pulse of peace that felt like a heartbeat beneath my skin. We had been married for a week now. 7 long, blissful days of quiet, whispered promises and breathless, late-night confessions. Of stolen glances and shared laughter and slow, sleepy mornings wrapped in each other's arms. The sun slipped below the horizon. The soft, golden light of the setting sun slipping through the thin, gauzy curtains of our balcony doors. The small, whispered promise of a new beginning slipping through the cool, polished air. I leaned in, my lips brushing against her ear, my breath warm against her skin, my voice low, my tone steady. The small, tight flicker of something like hope slipping into my expression as I whispered the small, breathless promise of forever into the dark, hidden corners of her mind. I love you, I whispered, my eyes locking with hers, my lips curling into a small, tight smile, my chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths as I pulled her closer, as I wrapped my arms around her, as I held her against my chest, as I whispered the small, breathless promise of forever into the soft, steady hum of the ocean slipping through the thin, polished air. She smiled, her eyes bright, her lips curling into a small, tight smile as she leaned in, her breath warm against my cheek, her voice low, her tone steady. The small, breathless hiss of a woman who has already realized the truth, who has already felt the first, sharp sting of her carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. I love you too, she whispered, her fingers tightening around my shirt, her chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths as she slipped her head onto my shoulder, as she closed her eyes, as she let herself melt into the small, warm space between us, as she wrapped her hands around my heart and whispered the small, breathless promise of forever into the cool, polished air of our small, sunlit balcony. And in that moment, I realized that I had finally come full circle, that I had finally found the love I had always deserved, that I had finally chosen the right sister, that I had finally found the woman who had slipped into the small, shattered spaces of my broken heart and made me whole again. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, as the soft, steady hum of the ocean slipped through the thin, polished air, as the small, whispered fragments of my shattered heart slipped back into place, I felt the first, sharp sting of something new. Something sharp. Something dangerous. Something that felt a lot like forever.
These weddings didn't end with I do. They ended with revenge, regrets, and reputations in ruins. Want more cold feet and colder comebacks? Hit subscribe and dive into the Savage Endings playlist. Because at this altar, the twist is always waiting at the end of the aisle.